Um, so today we'll be dealing with two chapters. So it's the first time that we're doing that. I think there's another week that we'll deal with two chapters. So it was a little more reading. Although chapter 7, I think, was easier to read. It was basically discussing security and how we make our systems more, let's say, protected from the challenges and the challenges imposed by hackers and others that want to crash into our systems and to get some sort of benefit out of it. But chapter 6, architecture and infrastructure, I think this is a little denser. This requires probably most of our attention. We'll probably spend at least the first half of our class today discussing chapter 6, because I do think that this is probably a very important topic for those of you who want to convert organizational strategy into IT infrastructure. Right? And in fact, one of the differences that are spotted here by the authors is a difference between architecture and infrastructure that is not always seen in the market. I see many times people talking about architecture, the IT architecture or the IT infrastructure, as if they were the same thing. They aren't, right? The architecture leads to the infrastructure, right? The architecture, and I think the authors here make a good analogy to the profession of let's say, a traditional engineering architect, right? Someone who let's say builds houses, because the architect is someone who tries to convey the owner's ideas into a plan that will later be turned into reality by a builder. So the architecture process related to the information technology that we use is, again, the work of an architect. And the architect may be, one of you guys. This architect may be someone in the computer industry, someone, a technologist, but it may also be someone from the business arena. The architect is someone that is in the middle of the way there, trying to help the organization to make sure that its strategy, its business strategy, is what drives the initiatives involved in building an infrastructure. Infrastructures are the assets that a company has to develop its business afterwards, right? And infrastructures, supposedly, they're there to help the business achieve its strategy. But many times, the infrastructure that companies have today is an infrastructure that was built thinking on the business of yesterday. Right? What I mean here is that we are planning, we are doing our strategic planning the whole time, but we make decisions on investments, and investments that turn many times into infrastructures that we build. And those infrastructures are going to be there could be there for much longer than the strategy itself. So one interesting consideration with respect to chapter 6 here is that we should start considering that strategy is becoming each time more volatile, that companies do not have a strategy any longer for the next 30 years. They have a strategy for the next 6 months. We also have to start thinking of more volatile infrastructures. And of course, that has to be designed. And this designing process of more volatile infrastructures is what the authors here call the architecture of the system. So think of the strategy as being the driver. You think your business, you think what you want to do, then you have to think of a way to achieve that. This plan is the architecture. And then the result, in terms of, at least, of physical assets, is the infrastructure. And the infrastructure is the result of the strategy that was planned for a specific time But after it has been turned into assets, and I'm calling here assets, hardware, software, even human skills, because if you train your people, if you develop skills that are, let's say, not very flexible, people will have those skills regardless of them being required or not for the business in the future, right? 200 years ago, or even 50 years ago, maybe you planned your strategy and you built infrastructures that could be there for 50 years, and you would be able to exploit that infrastructure for 50 years. Nowadays, depending on the infrastructure we built, we have to throw it away in, I may be exaggerating, in 6 months, but in a much shorter period of time. And this is something that the authors also discuss in this chapter when they talk about different types of infrastructure that we may build. Of course, we may build infrastructures that are more centralized or more decentralized. And again, thinking that infrastructure is a result of the plan related to our strategy. When will we build infrastructures that are more centralized? Basically, when we believe that our business is going to perform better if under a centralized control. So basically, centralized systems means that the control over the information that those systems gather, organize, make available for decision making, or make available even for the process. If that's centralized, it's because, well, and if the architecture is aligned, was aligned with the strategy, centralized systems usually mean that we're talking about a company that believes that centralized decision making is also important. It is also what makes that company more, let's say, more perform better in the markets. Decentralized systems or a decentralized infrastructure would possibly be the result of an architecture that tries to allow the decision making happens closer, for example, to the customers, or closer to the suppliers, or closer to, let's say, far away from from a central decision making headquarter, for example. Okay, so but when we're talking about centralized or decentralized decision making, and centralized and decentralized infrastructures, and here you may think of the organizations in which you work. Do they have centralized or decentralized IT? Right. We're still not talking about the timing of the strategies. Right. Companies tend to be centralized in the way that they run business, or decentralized in the way they run business for the longer run. Right. So those two specific types of strategy and infrastructures simply refer to where does the company believe that decision should be made. In the headquarters, or close to the customers, or close to the suppliers, or whoever is there in a position where, if you need agility and if maybe local characteristics should be taken into account. I remember that many years ago I read about the system that Walmart was implementing to serve all its shops, or all its stores around the United States. And basically, they had an idea that it made more sense for them. They had a strategy that it made more sense that they took their decisions in a very centralized way, because Walmart was a very, let's say, very strong buyer, right? Walmart bought very aggressively from its suppliers to ensure that it could provide its customers with a very low price. And the reason why they could be so aggressive as buyers was that they bought in huge quantities. And then, of course, they wanted to buy in huge quantities to benefit from that. They bought in huge quantities, and then they split that into smaller parts, smaller shares, and sent inventory to all their shops around the United States. So it was a very centralized business concept. And they also wanted and they actually established an infrastructure that was very centralized. Decision making was made at the headquarters. What is the problem with that kind of decision making? well, maybe no problem if it's their strategy, right? It's what they wanted to do. But there are situations where you would probably want to give the local manager of a store some decision making over, for example, even over the inventory, over the stock that is being used to replenish that shop. And I remember, I don't remember the case very well any longer because it's been probably some 15 years. But I remember that the one of the stores in Florida wanted to increase and wanted to increase severely the amount of insect repellents that they wanted to buy, and the manager had no way of doing that. But why did he want that? Because they were having in Florida a mosquito infestation. It was a local issue, but their whole system had been designed to make sure that all decisions were made nationwide for the whole country. So it didn't matter if they needed or wanted to have more insect repellents in that shop, and of course that would make them more profitable at that moment. But the system didn't allow them to do that. So notice that infrastructures are built to force the strategy to happen the way it was designed. But at that stage, Walmart was rethinking its strategy and thinking, well, for most things, maybe we want to have decision made from the headquarters and goods sold to the shops based on history of their previous 6 months or 1 year or 2 years or whatever, right? Their business was a very, let's say, wholesaling and even retailing are sort of, to some extent, they're predictable businesses, right? Walmart was not a very different business 20 years ago to what it is today. Of course, maybe today they have much more IT in the backgrounds. But let's say when we go to one of their retail shops, the experience that we have as customers is pretty much the same that we had 20 years ago, and maybe even further back, 50 years ago, or maybe 50 years ago. At least the cashier would not be so automated as it is today. But what I'm saying here is, notice Walmart, after having decided on a strategy that wanted to keep the control in the headquarters, at some stage realized that maybe that would happen, that would be good for most products, but they should give the manager of specific shops the control over at least part of what they were buying. They were changing their strategy, and that was not easy to change in the system because the system was not flexible. So nowadays, we do have the possibility of having systems that are more flexible in many ways. Of course, again, we have to ask, is that the intention of the strategy? Does the strategy want to increase flexibility? Then systems will be used to increase flexibility. Sometimes, and I would say for many companies, what they really want the systems to do is to reduce flexibility and prevent or avoid that the local manager takes a decision that goes against what is being thought there at the headquarters of the organization. So when someone says that the system does not allow you to do something, that means the system was designed, if it was well designed, the system was designed not to allow the user to act differently. So again, the spirit of the strategy will be shown, and I'm calling here the spirit purposely because the strategy has its own mood or its own spirit, the spirit of the strategy is conveyed in the infrastructure that we end up having when our architectural plan is put into place. But the chapter here talks about other alternatives that we have today. In the past, of course, we had no alternatives. The only way of having computers in an organization, for example, in the 60s and 70s, was mainframes. Mainframes were a very centralizing kind of infrastructure, right? And even if you didn't want to have centralized decision making, sometimes the technology is also imposing. I say that we try to use the strategy to determine how the infrastructure, but there are stages in which the technology that is available already sort of shapes the way we can organize our IT, right? So the IT of the 1960s, 70s, and maybe 80s was very centralized, simply because there were no personal computers. There was no possibility of connectivity. I mean, the connectivity was terminals being used by the users and a mainframe executing the program somewhere else. So we were even we were connected remotely, but basically all the processing happened there at the mainframe. Then, of course, in the 80s and 90s, we had the chaotic revolution of the PC. And I say chaotic because it really empowered the end user. And in fact, many companies during that period found it very difficult to define any sort of strategy for IT, simply because departments could decide on their own to buy personal computers. They were cheap, they were readily available, they were not very complicated technology. Therefore, a marketing, let's say, manager could decide, I want to try with that. And he would simply buy a personal computer for the department. And that was definitely not related to any thought or planned architecture. That became infrastructure, because if whatever we have, after we've made a decision and bought something, whatever we buy may turn into something difficult to sell later, right? Or it's impossible to sell. Many technology, it's very difficult to, after you buy it, you use it to get the best value you can, but nobody buys technology thinking of reselling it later, because the resale market is inexistent, right? Let's say the price of a second-hand computer is much lower than the price of a new one. So nobody thinks of, oh, if it doesn't fit my purposes, I'll just get rid of it. It's not feasible. So I think one important thing here is the decisions that we make end up becoming almost like ghosts that are there frightening us and sort of directing the decisions that we can still make in the future. Decision making about IT architecture and later about the infrastructure that you will build are decisions that last, or at least their consequences last longer than we would wish in many cases. Right? Sometimes we have already changed the strategy, but we still have that equipment, that software that we bought in the past, and that keeps puzzling our mind and saying, well, look, you cannot throw that away. It was so expensive. So sometimes we're not even being rational. Maybe throwing away infrastructure would be the most rational thing to do to free you so that you could decide on the new infrastructure that you need. But it's very difficult to take that decision, mainly because, of course, you decided for that infrastructure in the past, and throwing it away would be sort of admitting that decision that you took in the past is no longer sensible, is no longer valid or reasonable or whatever. Okay. So again, this idea that we should try and build infrastructures that do not become heavy loads that we can have to carry around in the future. So in the 60s and 70s, it was mainframes, very, very heavy loads. After you buy a mainframe, I mean, there are companies that still run the same mainframes. Of course, legacy systems. I don't know if we still have anything running from so much back then, but the thing is, many companies that at some stage decided on mainframe infrastructure, later on, when they already had other technological opportunities, other possibilities, many times they reinvested in newer mainframes, simply because keeping to that same infrastructure meant that they were still keeping their legacy worth something. So we still have a lot of systems today that reflect decisions that were made in the 60s or 70s for these more traditional companies. Probably here in Brazil, that happens in many banks, for example. Okay? This is why there are still people in computer science that learn COBOL, for example, a language that was very important for, let's say, for businesses in the past, that would nobody would say start a new project on COBOL today, but there are so many million lines of code that were written in that language that you still need people to keep, let's say, maintaining legacy software in those legacy systems. Right? But anyway, 60s and 70s the mainframe, 80s and 90s a chaotic introduction of microcomputing, originally completely disconnected, which means that the strategy was the strategy was building IT infrastructure that solved local problems. So each department solving their own issues, and with a nightmare of data sharing with other departments later, happening either through magnetic disks or even reports on paper that someone had to type in the other department, right? Then mainly in the 90s, we started having the internal networks and connectivity. And I'd say mainly in the 2000s, we had again a new paradigm of computing, that is the internet, with the possibilities of cloud computing and virtualization. Right? Curiously, a technology that brings us back to very close to the mainframe, right? At least conceptually, you're saying we have the possibility again of doing most of the processing in a more centralized way, and the user may only have it's not a terminal any longer, but a very dumb computer at his or her end, because most of the processing can happen in the cloud. Right? So there are the let's say the technological trends that affect the possible architecture, but at the same time, these technological trends are also some response or an answer to demands that the architects, and before the architects, the strategists needed for their business. Businesses became much more, how do I say, businesses need to be much more flexible today than they were in the past. So it doesn't make sense to buy very expensive IT to just establish the infrastructure, mainly because we have to be flexible in the sense that we don't know if the business is going to be if we're going to have more or less clients next week. I'm not even talking about 2 years from now. Right? Companies in general have, or at least the strategic planners of organizations do have a bit of what Professor René Seifert would call a cancerogenous perspective, right? René, for some of you who are his students, René claims that there are only two things that are born to grow no matter what: cancer and companies. Right? If a company doesn't grow, its employees, its owners, its customers, society in general will look at it and say they were not successful. It's let's say, it's the way we think in general. I'd say it's probably a very wrong way of thinking, because it is very reasonable that some company decides to develop a strategy only for sustainability in the market. I'm not talking about environmental sustainability. I'm talking here about a company that just wants to be there, right? Wants to be there, generating profits so that the owners are happy, generating enough profit so that salaries can be paid to the workers, and growing is not necessarily a goal, or should not be the goal of many businesses. And we'll go back a little bit to chapter 1 where we were discussing strategy, because why do we think that businesses need to grow? Well, simply because we're led to think that way. But we're led to think that way, and now this is my understanding, right? It's not necessarily academic here. I'm not sure if I've ever read anyone saying that, but my understanding of the reason why companies believe and do not question the fact that they have to simply grow is that during the Industrial Revolution, the only way to succeed in a competitive market was to develop scale, and developing scale could only happen if the company grew. Nowadays, we don't have that, let's say, that condition any longer. It's not the only way of surviving in the market, or even of getting profitable in the market, to simply grow and grow and grow. We have the possibility of, and a strategic decision of maybe being small or maybe growing when the market is growing, but also having the flexibility to shrink and to become smaller when whatever we do is not understood as the most important product in the market any longer. So we should think of more flexible infrastructures. And who gives us more flexible infrastructures these days? What are the technologies that allow for more flexible infrastructures? Those that we can buy or hire depending on our demand. So we hear a lot of software as a service, or even platforms as a service. Yes, Pedro is writing there, software as a service, cloud. Basically, what's happening there is if we need, we hire more. If we don't, we don't need to be the owners of the infrastructure any longer. For many businesses, there are businesses that would still prefer to be the owners of the infrastructure for several different reasons. I would say what would be a good reason for someone to decide I want to have my own infrastructure? What do you think, or for what you read? John was saying autonomy, but autonomy in the sense that you can do things on your own without depending on others. That's right. If we depend on Amazon, for example, for, let's say, for servers, we can always think what happens to our business if Amazon goes out of market, or what happens if Amazon decides that that's not an important business for them any longer, and then they will stop it. Oh, I would say this is probably an issue for other very large companies, right? For a small company, small companies are flexible enough, possibly for even if Amazon decides to give up that business, small companies are flexible to change its own business but large companies, if they become too reliant or too dependent on another company, that may be a big issue for them. Okay? Gabriel also mentions compliance, security, backups. All of them are things that for sure are taken into account by those who are deciding strategically, do I want to own my own infrastructure, or will I accept that there may be issues, right, with a supplier, but I accept that the risk, for example, the risk with security. If I am a small company, probably trying to ensure security in my own servers would be riskier than having Amazon take care of that for me. Okay, so the concern is right there, Gabriel. I say, and for many large companies, security would be an issue, because they say, well, I don't know, all my data is in the hands of a third party. Do I trust them enough? A small company, or us as individuals, we trust them, right? Because we don't have much to lose. I mean, what happens if Google starts reading my emails and trying to get my clever ideas from there and start their own business to compete with mine, right? We all have this feeling that we are invisible in the middle of the crowds, or even if we are visible, for someone to pay attention to what we are doing or what we may do in the future, they have so many others to look at. We're sort of guaranteed there. So notice that different companies and or different people may look at this and see actually in some cases even the opposite of what Gabriel said there. For example, for security and backups, I trust. For example, I trust Google. I have a lot of my classes and everything. They're on Google. They're also on my hard drive here, just in case. But if you ask me, who do I trust the most? If my own drive or Google, I would say I think I have better chances of having a secure backup with Google than on my computer. My computer may crash at any stage, and I rely on their backup. Compliance, depending on the business, may be an issue also. So Gabriel also says there, it's the basis of the shared responsibility model. They just take care of a part. The integrity and the security of the data is the company's responsibility. Of course, that will also depend on the service that you're hiring, right? there will be, you can hire a service in which you're basically only, let's say, hiring the infrastructure, and then you are the one who's responsible for security, for backup, for everything. And there are, you can also hire the whole package and say, you become my IT department in terms not of the strategy, but at least of the operation of it. I will outsource my concerns with respect to backup, security, and everything to third party. But notice they're all strategic decisions. They're strategic decisions that I would say 15 years ago, large companies found it very difficult to accept the risk of outsourcing infrastructure. Nowadays, I see very large companies outsourcing also because although they acknowledge that there are risks involved, they're always balancing those risks against the risks of doing things internally, right? But you're right. These things need to be taken into account. The great advantage of the cloud for most companies is that they can hire whatever infrastructure they need as a service, which means if they're profiting a lot, that means that they need a lot of service. They pay more for the service that they're getting. If at the moment their business is not doing that great, they simply do not hire the service and do not spend so much on infrastructure. So it provides companies with flexibility, a lot of flexibility. And again, who will want flexibility? I'd say companies today tend to want much more flexibility than in the past. But of course, companies that have very reliable, very resilient processes, companies that are very confident that their business is going to be about the same next year or just a little more, a little less, they may still prefer to have the infrastructure internally because they know exactly the infrastructure that they will need. And of course, when you're hiring from someone else and you're saying, well, I may need, but I may not, that means that this outsourced party they have to plan not for the minimum that you may need. They have to plan for the maximum that you may need. So they will have available infrastructure and someone will be paying for that. Of course, what they do is they know that not everyone will be needing the maximum infrastructure at the same time, right? So they know that your business, the time that you need more infrastructure, someone else may be needing less. And so they work statistically with that and make sure that everyone has the amount of, let's say, infrastructure that they need. But if your business is stable and all is the same, I would say probably you will find that it's cheaper and you will probably find it easier. If your business is really stable, all those other services that you could outsource, like backup, security, and so on and so forth, those you're already accustomed to do. You already have people that are hired in your company to do that. You may find it easy to simply keep doing exactly what you were doing before. So even in a situation where most companies now need more flexibility, there will be companies that will still develop strategies and therefore architectures and therefore infrastructures that seem more similar to what we had in the past. I would say their business is probably more similar to businesses that were there in the past also. Right? Again, we have to think that there is room in the market for different strategies, and there's room in the market for the different architectures that we may get based on that. All right, let me show here my screen. I want to go through some of the pages in our book and things that caught my attention. And then we'll also go and see what caught your attention, okay? So let me see here. One interesting thing that I noticed here is when they already point out to us here that when they mention this company here, Mohawk for me was that kind of haircut that you only had hair on the top here. But this Mohawk company, it's the case that they start the chapter with. and they say that this company used to be a very traditional company in the paper industry. And then at some stage, they realized that the business was stable, but the only way for them to grow or to keep growing, and again, notice that they had the growing bug there. We don't necessarily need to grow, but they saw the potential of keeping growing if they started, let's say, advancing or progressing towards products that were let's say, products that used their original product as raw material. So they saw the possibility of starting making envelopes and not just the paper, the plain paper. And they did that by, well, they started, they needed to think of a way of connecting their company to many of its which used to be their customers, now would be their partners. And they need to connect electronically better to work in more like in a supply chain fashion, in which the different businesses connect to one another and look more like if they were just one only business, right? And then here they say that Mohawk needed to develop a cloud computing infrastructure, and it was not just a mechanism to avoid or reduce costs or to gain operational benefits. If you remember when we discussed strategy a couple of weeks ago, we said that although many times people think of IT as a way of doing more or more efficiently the same thing, IT can also be a very important strategic tool, allowing us to do different things. And this is basically what Mohawk is doing here, right? They're trying. They don't want to be just a paper company any longer. They want to do more than that, but they need systems. They need an infrastructure that allows them to organize their activities better with their customers, and in that way, they provide us a product that has more value for a customer that is, let's say, closer to the or is further downstream the value chain. Okay. So they say here that the cloud and associated services can support a transformation of the business itself. So it's the business, the technology here, the architecture. The plan is to develop an infrastructure that allows them to have a different business to the business that they had before. Okay. And here they also say that the Mohawk story illustrates how infrastructure decisions can enable the strategic objectives of a firm. They had the strategy, and then they developed the infrastructure, and that's the way it has to be, right? Because if we develop the infrastructure without having a very clear strategy in mind, we will become the slaves of the infrastructure that we create. I keep saying that infrastructures instead they can support the strategy that we developed, but they can also enforce strategies that we don't want. I keep saying, for example, of course, today we are using a different technology here that is actually allowing a different, let's call it a different business in education. You are at home, I am at home, and we are having a class that is, I think, pretty much, that has a lot to do with what used to be a face-to-face class in the past, except that many of you don't open your cameras. But I do think that we have something here that is close enough. It's a good replacement with some advantages and some disadvantages. So it's a new, let's say, we can develop a different strategy here. But when we think of the regular classrooms that we have, for example, there at UTFPR, with desks lined one after the other in rows, that is, for those of you for whom the term infrastructure is still a little vague, that is infrastructure. After we have those desks there is no way we can teach a class in a less conventional way. And I mean, there's no way you can become creative and decide to teach a class or to turn the class into something different than the class different than what that infrastructure invites you to do or allows you to do. So one interesting thing that the authors say here, architecture translates strategy into infrastructure. So if for you, architecture, when someone talked about IT architecture or IT infrastructure, you thought as being the same thing? No, the architecture is the process to lead you to having an infrastructure. I think they have here a drawing that shows that well. Is here, and in fact, it's the drawing where they have that analogy with an architect building planning or designing a house for the builder to implement. And when we think about information technology, we think of the business and then an architecture and an infrastructure. The important thing here for us, guys, is that when we look at the strategy, the architecture as the plan, and the infrastructure being decided there as a result, we definitely have to think very well of the reasons for which to set an infrastructure, because after we set an infrastructure, it may be years to get rid of it. Again, I cannot get rid of my desks in the regular classroom, right? We may sometimes try and change let's say the way we organize the desks, and I say let's sit in a circle. Of course, if you have just a few students, you can do that. But if you have 40 students in a class, you can arrange them in those lines of students, but it's impossible to do that simply because those desks will take a lot of room. Of course, if we had conceived from the beginning, we had as a strategy to have a round classroom instead of lines of students, we would not have those desks, or at least they would be very different. And maybe we could even fit the same 40 students in this different layouts. But layouts are infrastructures, and infrastructures tend to be very, let's say, very rigid in time. Okay, and then the author then talks a little bit about the manager's role. Remember that this book here was written by IS professors, information systems professors from the United States. And in the United States, most IS professors are in business departments. So when they're talking here about the manager's role, they are not necessarily talking about the CIO. They're talking about the managing the business managers and deciding what they need to know and what they need to do in order to develop the architecture and infrastructure. And here they say managers must understand what to expect from IT architecture and infrastructure. For those of you who are IT guys, you may say, yes, of course, as a manager, I have to understand that. But think that what the authors are talking about here is managers with a business manager should try and understand what is expected from this IT infrastructure and architecture infrastructure to be able to make full and realistic use of them and to make sure that the plans do not block important business considerations. After we build an infrastructure, if the infrastructure was not well designed, it may even block important the development of the intended strategies afterwards. The same way as my regular classroom with lines of desks blocks the possibility of me having a roundtable conversation with my students. In fact, this technology here, it does allow, it's not as, let's say, it's still infrastructure, and being an infrastructure, it already sets a lot of things that we can do. It also sets a lot of things that we cannot do, but at least in that sense, it would be possible for us to have a relatively different class in the sense that here we're not all lined, one behind the other as students. Here, maybe we could consider that we are all in a round table in which each one of us can take their turn and provide their impressions or say what they thought of the text and so on and so forth. And notice that even when the technological infrastructure allows for that in the educational process, the fact that we were exposed for so long to the traditional lecture format contributes for us to be sort of doing the same thing that we did in the traditional classroom. So notice that infrastructures, sometimes their effects happen even when they are not there any longer. The infrastructure is not there any longer, but it's wired in our minds. Of course, in our case here, I do understand that for this class, we also have the communication issue. Many of you are already struggling to pay attention and to follow what we are doing in a foreign language here, which makes it this class a little less, let's say, with more turns and taking turns to talk. You get less involved. I think that there is also this issue. I'm sure that if we were doing this in Portuguese, you would be possibly debating or discussing the text much more than you are. Maybe you would be providing your opinions much more frequently than you are here. But notice that this could also be the fact that although the infrastructure is not the traditional classroom any longer, we had that infrastructure for so long that it still gives us this impression that the teacher talks, the students listen, which made sense in the past, which makes very little sense nowadays, because I mean, and I've already confessed this to you, right? That I'm, especially with respect to this textbook here, I am reading together with you, right? I read the chapters that were assigned for today, last night, and today in the morning, the same way as possibly as most of you did. So of course I sort of know what they are going to talk about, but I don't know, for example, the examples that they're showing here. I don't even the order they're presenting their chapters and everything. This is as new to me than it is to you. But still, the fact that for so long we were hardwired to think the teacher talks and we listen makes you listen more than talking. Even in a class where the teacher admits that he knows just, I mean, he read the text together with you. All right. Here, without the involvement of the business manager, IT architecture could inadvertently make decisions that limit the manager's business options in the future. Think infrastructures, the same time that they, let's say, that they leverage the strategies for which they were created, they limit other strategies that were not taken into account in the definition of the infrastructure. Here they say, notice, in earlier infrastructure decisions now made it prohibitively expensive to implement the capability he wanted. Here they're talking about a company in which the manager had not taken care of making sure that the infrastructure was what he needed. And then when he went there and tried to make changes, the infrastructure was already there, and it was very difficult, if not impossible, to change. So instead, so the infrastructure lacked the architecture that met the business objectives of the sales and marketing departments. If the infrastructure is not designed to meet the strategy, there's very little that we can do afterwards, because the infrastructure will impose itself. I keep saying that infrastructures become decision makers after they're there, right? After you have an infrastructure in place, your decisions are not as free as they were in the past. And this is, again, one of the arguments why we should try and have as flexible infrastructures as possible. Here in the next page, they describe that process of first translating the strategy into architecture, and then translating the architecture into infrastructure as being the regular way to go, to make sure that the infrastructure will be there to help the organization achieve its strategy. Then they talk a little bit about governance here. There's a specific chapter about governance that we have already discussed. The governance arrangements specify who in the company retains control and responsibility for IS. Preferably, it is somebody in the upper management. But notice that when they say here, preferably someone in the upper management, maybe they're already giving us an idea that they sort of prefer a centralized fashion of conducting the strategy, right? Because I think there are many possibilities of having emerging businesses where you could say exactly the opposite. Instead of saying preferably someone in the upper management, you could say preferably that manager there close to the customer. Remember the manager of Walmart that wanted to have insect repellent for its customers, and nobody would listen to him simply because in other parts of the United States they were not having problems with mosquitoes. So notice that I found this a little interesting, and I myself don't understand why they write here preferably someone in the upper management. Depending, if you need central control, headquarters in charge and knowing about everything that is happening, I'd agree with this. But there are many businesses that do perform much better if the control is there close to where action is happening. On this page, they also have this diagram here that shows, sort of gives us a roadmap of how to turn the strategy, divided or split into several goals, and then for those goals, the definition of some business requirements, and then those business requirements will be used by the architects of the infrastructure to determine the architectural requirements. So business requirements turn into architectural requirements. The architectural requirements are all there to try and meet the business requirements, and then this architecture will help develop the infrastructure, and the infrastructure will be based on functional specifications that are needed to ensure that things happen the way that they should, and then also converted into hardware, software, data interface specifications. This is basically the infrastructure. They discuss a bit the idea of platform. A platform is a combination of hardware and software that form the basic system that hosts applications and services used by the business and others in its ecosystem. Notice that they go on with the explanation of what a platform is, but then they say that even an app can become a platform based on this definition. Because, for example, if any of you writes a game, what they mentioned here is a game to run on what was the name of the Facebook? Facebook becomes, it's an app, but it becomes a platform, right? In the sense that your application will run on top of that and making sense of things that happen only in that environment there. So this is where they say here that other times a platform refers to a specialized system for specific business applications such as sales, Salesforce automation, web design, and so on and so forth. Platforms are many times hardware and or software that offer basic functionality, and apps are plugins to the platform that offer additional features or services. But notice that sometimes these apps themselves become or could become a platform, which is interesting. It shows then some interesting tables in which they discuss the infrastructure and architecture analysis based on simple questions. So, for example, when you're thinking about the architecture that you're building and the resulting infrastructure, for example, with respect to hardware, you could ask there, what type of personal device will our users use? You're thinking of based on the business that you, and then based on that, you will define the the infrastructure, right? The actual hardware. What size hard drives do we equip our laptops with? Notice that some concerns, the architectural concerns, are still broader, and the infrastructure concerns already relate to the, let's say, the hardware, the software, the tools that you need to make sure that architecture's intent is accomplished. They mentioned here, I think we've already discussed a bit about the mainframe, the decentralized structures. They mentioned here the legacy systems. That I say legacy systems become infrastructure that sometimes doesn't make sense any longer, or still makes sense. It's hard to replace, and therefore you keep feeding it. And you have to consider your strategy should always consider the legacy systems that you have, even to decide when to discontinue it, because there will be a situation in which there will be a time where you are going to say, enough. Now it's time that we, even realizing that we'll have to put a lot of efforts to replace this legacy. The legacy is determining what we are doing and not helping us do what we should be doing. Here they talk about decentralized architecture, server-based architecture, service-oriented architecture. Those things I think we've already covered somehow. A little more on here on centralized and decentralized structures. Decentralized architectures are more modular than centralized architectures. Does that make sense to you? Decentralized architectures are more modular than centralized architectures. Why do they need to be more modular? Because basically you need interfaces. They will have to be connected with other parts of the system that happen elsewhere, sometimes in other locations. And the only way of ensuring that those interfaces work correctly is if you plan modules that already are conceived to talk to one another, right? Centralized architectures may be very much more integral, and they may be a one only body, because there is no concern about having to connect with something else that is happening somewhere else, because everything is happening in a centralized way. And then here it talks about the obvious idea that centralized organizational governance is consistent with, a decentralized organizational governance is consistent with decentralized architectures, and at the same time, centralized architectures tend to be a better match in companies with highly centralized governance. So it's always important for those who are developing the architecture to understand the culture of an organization beforehand, to understand the business itself, because all of those things affect the way the infrastructure could help the organization. What else? Then they discuss some architectural principles. That's here, architectural principles. Basically, those are the principles that we will use to drive the architecture itself, right? So if I have a principle that I want to develop infrastructure that is easy to use, then what will the architecture promote? Ease of use in building and supporting the architecture and solutions based on the architecture. Again, if I want a single point of view, then this is what I'll do. So it's interesting the way here they mentioned several possible principles, and of course the principles of the architecture are defined by the strategist together with the architect, with those who will, let's say, implement the required or the wished infrastructure. And then they discuss some ways of developing this enterprise architecture. They have some examples here. Some of them are better known than others. I'm sort of acquainted with TOGAF, this open group architecture framework. I have to confess that I had never heard of this Zachman enterprise architecture model. I think that my understanding is that Zachman, I think, was also an author in information systems, I believe, right? But I didn't know this model. And then they also show here, Gartner has models for everything, right? So it would be surprising if they did not have a model for enterprise architecture, which is not surprising with respect to Gartner. Is when they claim here that there is a weakness, they say the weakness is that after the architectures are articulated, the implementation process is less specified when you use Gartner here, and likely to require consultant help to complete. Why do they build, let's say, an enterprise architecture, a way of developing your architecture in which you become reliant on consultants? Obviously, because Gartner is a consulting firm, so they help you first develop your architecture, and then they say, well, now we'll help you implement. Andre is saying that they are using TOGAF for to improve the processes that they have there. Yeah, TOGAF is I'm not absolutely, probably Andre knows it better than I do, but at least TOGAF is something that we read about all the time. I've never got involved in this process of defining infrastructure through architecture. So this is why this is something that for me is a little theoretical. But TOGAF, I know that many companies use, not only in the US, of course, here in Brazil as well. What else? And then they have a section here on virtualization and cloud computing, showing the advantages that those that are provided by those possibilities of architecture. Physical corporate data centers are rapidly being replaced by virtual infrastructures called virtualization. It's, for most companies, it makes no sense any longer to have their own physical infrastructure, although we have already discussed here, and many of you pointed out a few reasons why companies may still wish to have it, right? But the advantage of having or hiring infrastructure as a service is that if you don't need it, you don't pay for it. And then they explain here, give an explanation of virtualization is a useful way to design architecture because it enables resources to be shared and allocated as needed by the user and makes maintenance easier because resources are centralized. Notice again, advantages of having centralized infrastructure or decentralized infrastructure. Decentralized infrastructure empowers those that are closer to where things are actually happening. Centralized infrastructures also reduce, we had not discussed this advantage here, but even reduces the maintenance costs because you do it in one only location where you have probably people that are assigned specifically to do that. Okay? And cloud computing is another term used to describe an architecture based on services provided over the internet. It is based on the concept of a virtual infrastructure. Let's talk here a bit about infrastructure as a service, which is one of the main advantages. And they even gets to talk about here what they call utility computing. Utility computing is basically when your computing becomes almost like any other utility. And usually in English, we use the word utility to talk about energy, electricity, to talk about water supply, right? Things that do not, that we use depending on our demand. If we need more water, we open the tap. If we need the water, we just close the tap and we don't pay for it, right? Or we pay a minimum fee. There's this concept here of using technology as a utility. Pedro is saying that my company architecture is moving heavily from virtualization to cloud computing. Yeah, that's virtualization and cloud computing, as you notice are cloud computing, let's say, is even closer to infrastructure as a service, because virtualization, you may still maybe the infrastructure is not yours, but you're still performing all the efforts. It's what we were talking before about you may have a server that is in the cloud, but you have to maintain it and make sure that it's safe and everything. And cloud computing usually already happens in the hands of a third party who's specialized on that, and therefore could even provide you with more safety and with a better level of service than if you did it yourself. And then it still claims here that the biggest benefit of virtualization and cloud computing is the speed at which additional capacity or provisioning can be done. In a traditional data center, additional capacity is often a matter of purchasing additional hardware, waiting for its delivery, physically installing it, and ensuring its compatibility with the existing systems. It may take months, right? When you are using a cloud service, it may just be a matter of either hiring more infrastructure, or if you already have a flexible contract, simply using more infrastructure than you were using before. Okay, then we have some discussion here about assessing the time frame, strategic time frame. Notice that understanding the lifespan of an IT infrastructure and architecture is critical. How long will that last? Remember that the costs involved in acquiring technology and developing infrastructure are heavy. How long will we be able to benefit from that? Notice that, and at the same time, the infrastructure may last, but will your strategy last? The authors here remind us that strategic decisions may also be viewed as temporary. The environment changes, your needs or the needs of your customers may also change. So this is why we need, and we want and need the maximum flexibility and scalability to ensure they can handle immediate business changes. Businesses are changing each time faster, and we want to be able to adapt to that. I claim here that adaptability these days is a core design principle of every IT infrastructure. And this is why cloud computing and virtualization are becoming each time more popular. Then they provide us with some guidelines here about how to develop this architecture. First, plan for the application and systems that are independent and loosely coupled rather than monolithic. So basically, they're saying nowadays, don't go mainframe-like, right? Plan for systems that work more like modules that you can connect to one another, because when chances are that you are not going to need to get rid of them all at once. But if you have to replace one of them, you just take that part or that module away and include a new module that does whatever the market thinks that became more necessary. Set clear boundaries between infrastructure components. Here we're talking about interfaces. Again, if I want to have a modular infrastructure, boundaries are very important, because later I can just change parts or modules if those interfaces are well defined. And a robust and consistent network architecture simplifies training and knowledge sharing and provides some redundancy also, right? Some resource redundancy also. Then they talk a bit about the issues related to scalability and standardization. So scalability refers to how well an infrastructure component can adapt to increased or even decreased demands in the future. Right? Again, we should not think that we are here as a company to grow indefinitely. There may be a situation that we want to shrink or to become smaller. And if we do have control over the infrastructure so that we can get rid of part of it, this scalability in reverse will also be very beneficial. And they talk here also about standards as technical specifications that are expected to be followed throughout the infrastructure. Again, important, the definition of standards also relates to possibility of modularizing systems, of making sure that there are parts that, if replaced, they can be replaced by others that have the same function, and that things are going to work. Same way as they will, you should consider scalability and standardization. You should also consider maintainability. Is it easy to maintain? Will we be able to maintain the systems accordingly? Maintainability, also, or better explained as the ease and speed with which a system can be made to run correctly again after a failure occurs is very important, right? Our systems have become or do become very sophisticated, and sometimes, the same way as it's difficult to build the systems infrastructure, it's also difficult to maintain it. And if it takes too long to maintain a system, we may be impaired even in keeping the business going, right? Sometimes you have to stop doing business until the system is available to support it again. So that's what we don't want. Keep it simple if possible. Think of maintainability already from the time that you're developing the infrastructure. They also claim that we should, of course, think of security. And of course, we'll address that in chapter 7. But security is a matter of protecting every endpoint in a system, the access to servers, the access to the network, the access to everyday user devices, and so on and so forth. You don't want the business to be risked based on security issues that you may have. And then you also have financial and managerial issues. I don't recall if I told you when we were discussing strategy in chapter 1, there's this author, Nicholas Carr, who wrote some 20 years ago a very influential paper on Harvard Business Review, this American journal, whose title was "IT Doesn't Matter." And basically what he was saying was that developing IT to obtain proprietary or proprietary competitive edge was something that was becoming rarer and rarer. Most of the times, IT had or was becoming simply infrastructure, as these authors here tell utility. Remember that 2 pages back, they were saying that the infrastructure could be simply a utility. Software as a service becomes a utility. You use it as you need. When you don't need, you don't use it any longer. But you're the same way as you can hire that, the competition can also do it, which means that nobody is developing any competitive edge based on that. So if I'm not saying that happens with all strategic decisions involving IT, but Nicholas Carr claims that companies should focus on using IT for its infrastructural possibilities. Basically, they said don't try to obtain the advantage for your business based on proprietary technology, because that's too risky. Of course, we can debate that. There's a lot of, we can definitely argue that there are situations in which the IT that you create, that you develop, is precisely what is going to make your business more attractive than the competition. But we still have to consider financial and managerial issues here. Payback from IT investment is often difficult to quantify. In fact, there was a time that people even mentioned that we lived a productivity paradox because companies spent huge amounts of money in information technology, and it was very difficult to find evidence that that expenditure converted into better performance in the markets. I think that this discussion is over. There is definitely, I think that nowadays companies have learned how to invest in IT, and maybe in the past one of the problems is that they didn't even understand what they were investing on. Now there's more competent decision making being made with respect to IT, and therefore I don't even discuss the productivity paradox any longer here, because I think it's not there. But we do have to think of this difficulties in measuring value and of course trying to quantify the costs involved. Cost is actually what we have to pay for it. Determining the anticipated life cycles of the components. If the life cycle is too short, we have to decide if it's worth making the investment. Quantifying the benefits. So notice that we quantify the costs, and then we also quantify the benefits, quantify the risks involved, and there is a lot of risks. This is not what we'll be talking about in chapter 7. There it's just security, but governance, for example, that we have already discussed to some extent, is basically about managing risks involved and consider the cost-benefits relationship here to decide if the decisions are wise to be taken. Well, I think this is actually what we had for chapter 6, but I would like to just reflect very quickly with you guys about, again, I do think that we have to discuss those study cases a bit, because I mean, you will have to write a study case, right? So it's better that you're familiar with the format of this study case. I just wanted to discuss this study case. Where's let's see, it's here. No, study case 161. They're talking about this enterprise architecture at Chubb Industries. For you to remember, this is the complaint here was that the offices, the several offices around the United States and other parts of the world, were not following the headquarters strategy so closely as let's say the upper management wished, and they wanted a system that sort of controlled that. I'd say so. This is a system that goes from trying to make a system that an infrastructure that is more decentralized and trying to make it more centralized. If that's the strategy, and there's no, let's say this strategy is probably a little, could be considered a little old-fashioned. We have more strategies that go the other way, right? Providing people with more decision-making opportunities closer to where, as I was saying, action is happening, people that understand better what's happening with the customers and everything. But sometimes we want it reversely. And in this case, apparently this company here wanted to have, the upper management wanted to have more control. And then they show us here 5 questions at the end that maybe we could quickly discuss here. What are the key components of the architecture Chubb created? If we think, so the strategy was to centralize, right? What did they do to centralize, to try and centralize their strategy? Maybe what we could do is, I just want to read these questions quickly, and maybe before we start discussing the chapter 7, security, after our break, we could start with answering this question. So you have a time to reread very quickly the study case, right? Why was it important to standardize so much of the architecture? What are the advantages and the disadvantages of a standard EA for Chubb, right? And here we're talking about the EAs, the enterprise architecture for Chubb. Describe how the new architecture supports the goals and strategies of Chubb. Compare and contrast the advantages and disadvantages of the centralized and decentralized EA at Chubb, and what is your vision of how the target architecture might work in the future? If you were advising Jim Knight, this is the CIO of Chubb, what challenges would you suggest his group to prepare for? So just have a look at these questions again, or have a look at the study case, which is on page 154. And when we come back after the break, we can go straight to that. Was it centralized or decentralized?
Centralized, no?
At the beginning, what he had created was decentralized.
Mm-hmm.
He claims, let me see here if I...
He got many troubles because they were doing repeatedly the same solutions what I got.
Exactly. When you have a decentralized infrastructure, it means that each at each place, at each location where they had a facility, people were solving the problems over and over again. And they thought, well, being centralized in that sense will reduce the effort involved. So he was particularly, one thing that he thought that was particularly important was establishing these standards, right? And because standards were not being followed closely enough, and business units were focusing on their own units' goals, but sub-optimizing the organizational goals. Maybe this would be a problem similar to what Walmart would have if they had a decentralized way of deciding on stocks, and that Miami guy who wanted to have the insect repellents was deciding on his own. In that case, it would be great, but the problem is that he would be in other things that were the same for the whole country, and a central and deciding in a centralized fashion would allow to figure out a trend for the whole country. That would be wasted because each one would be deciding on their own inventory. Okay. All right. The second question that he posed here was, why was it important to standardize then? What are the advantages and disadvantages of a standard enterprise architecture? The advantages would be you don't have repetitive work, right? What would be a disadvantage? Is there a disadvantage for emphasizing these standards? Probably again the same as what happened with Walmart, right? The disadvantage when you're centralized is that if someone has a clever idea or a clever solution for a local problem, you do not allow them to develop that, because you're saying, no, we do everything in a standardized way. Everyone does the same. How does this new architecture support the goals and strategy of Chubb? What was the new the goals and strategy? What he mentions here the main components of this architecture as being the architectural principles, the architectural governance, conceptual reference architecture, and emerging technology.
I believe that with this new architecture, they could see the whole company as one, no sub-companies than there was before it.
Exactly. So they believe that they would benefit from having a united vision, a united strategy, and not each one trying to push things towards what they believed locally. Perfect.
On the old model, it seems like they were a lot of minor companies and not a big company.
Exactly. And again, notice different strategies are possible. This was their perception. Those that were deciding the strategy thought we prefer to centralize things and standardize things and benefit from the scale of the business instead of benefiting from providing customers, local customers, with an adjusted interpretation of their needs. Right? They prefer it's sort of a McDonald's approach, right? Everyone will eat Big Mac around the world. It doesn't matter if the taste in Brazil is different to the taste in Europe or the United States. We standardize and we push that product the way it is because it suits our strategy. Of course, this may not be the best example because McDonald's does play a little bit with flavor and does make little changes from country to country, but still, they still decide in a very centralized way. Yeah, so we sort of already discussed the advantages and disadvantages of centralized or decentralized, and well, now it's this one is more like an opinion. What is your vision of how the target architecture might work in the future? If you were advising Jim Knight, the CIO of Chubb, what challenges would you suggest this group prepare for? Basically, here, I think this is they already want your vision means your impressions. Each one of you may have a different answer here. I would say centralizing is a counter tendency in our world today. Centralizing means a few people deciding and affecting the lives of many, right? Decentralizing seems more suitable for most businesses in an environment where things change fast. When things change fast, it's better to have several brains and each one try to figure out solutions, local solutions, than maybe a centralized planning deciding on what is going to happen for everyone. But again, even in a world that is changing rapidly and quickly, where we tend to foster more initiative, more creativity from the people so that we can adjust the business, even in an environment like that, there will be companies that will find that that they could benefit from a more centralized perspective. Again, McDonald's is one of those. This Chubb seems to be another company that is a bit like that. All right. With respect to chapter 7, I'll stop sharing here. I want to do it. The feeling I had about chapter 7 is that, well, it makes us aware of the issue of security. But one thing that I didn't like here is that I did not read, and I may have missed something, but I did not read the words social engineering here. Did anyone see if it could have been in somewhere? I didn't see that expression, social engineering. Although
I didn't read this, as you said, but I wrote in my reflections,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I do think that they're talking about social engineering in several examples that they give here. In fact, this is the main issue related to security for most companies. The main problem is, in general, the employees themselves. Well, the problem is not the employees, but probably the company not training them carefully and not making sure that they understand security issues probably leads to many of the security issues that companies have. So in most cases, that depends on what we usually call social engineering. Again, I don't know why they did not mention that expression, because it's the expression we use to say that the weakest link in the security, let's say, issue is always the human element. So humans tend to allow the problems to happen, and therefore I think that and the chapter does that. The chapter does emphasize that you have to train people and you have to make them aware of the main kinds of security problems that we may have in the organizations. So the chapter is right. I was just curious with the fact that they did not mention social engineering as the term that we usually use for that. But as I said, instead of showing the text and discussing it, I'd like to start by asking: have any of you already implemented the NIST cyber security framework in your organizations? The NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They create a framework. They created a framework, and nowadays it is probably what I would say that when companies concerned with security, they think of that as a, let's say, at least as a guideline, as a model to start. Have any of you already implemented, or are you familiar with NIST cybersecurity framework? No? No one? Okay, this is basically this was a demand by President Barack Obama to the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They have standards for many things, but they said, look, we need standards to discuss security issues, and they have developed this set of standards, most of which deal with social engineering as well, with the issues involved in people being the fragile link, or the link where problems usually happen. This NIST framework, it is based on well, they claim here identifying the problem, protecting, detecting whatever malicious action or whatever, responding to it, and recovering. And it also involves something that they discuss closer to the end of the chapter, that is trying to build defenses that work in several layers, also to provide the organization with ways of preventing a major problem, even if an attack or an attempt to crack into the system has already happened. The authors here even claim that in the future, there will be no system that doesn't go at least through a double check, right? Nowadays, we still have many systems that rely simply on a password, and after we provide the password, we are in. But what we already seen happening with our cell phone information and everything that or passwords that we need for banks, that before you provide them with let's say a numeric generated token that is sent to your cell phone or something, you cannot have access. They claim that this will become the regular way of doing business. Of course, the more we try to prevent or to prevent security issues, the more inconvenience we generate to users, right? So it's always this dilemma of trying to balance the required level of security with the least inconvenience to users. In fact, and I would say that most of us as individuals already think that we experience a high level of inconvenience with passwords, and passwords that need to be changed frequently, and passwords that need to be checked and checked by several different means that take time or consume effort, generate stress, and so on and so forth. But the fact is that in the future, this will probably become even more so than in the past. Although, again, I'm far from being an expert in security, but I do think that asking people to change their passwords often is probably riskier from a social engineering perspective than allowing them to keep their passwords for longer, because then they will have to think of a new password. Something that they will not remember easily, and that will end up on a post-it or a note in their computer below their table, or just a simple variation of previous passwords. Gabriel is saying that one little thing that I applied in my life is to use a password manager. Just have to remember one stronger password. And maybe you're right, Gabriel. This is probably a very wise thing to do. The problem, I don't use that myself, although I think I should. But the problem I see with that is still, I mean, where do you hold that password? Even if you tell me I hold it in my mind, then I'll say, okay, so whoever has your cell phone and your minds together has access to all your passwords. But what I mean here is, if I had one of these, let's say, password managers, I would probably not want to carry it on my cell phone. And if I don't carry it in my cell phone, the level of inconvenience is still there, because I can only use the password manager from my bunker, right? From so we do have an issue there. This is something that I've even discussed already. The other day I was talking to my bank manager and said, you want me to have a card with me, and you want me to have an electronic wallet, but you only give me one password. If you gave me 5 passwords, it would be well. If you gave me 2 passwords, one of them would be for the robber, and the other one would be for when I need more money. But I prefer, instead of doing that, what I prefer to do is not going out with my regular bank card. I just get one of these electronic bank cards that allows me to to spend 1,000 reais at the most, and that's what I carry around, because I don't see even the banks giving you good security solutions these days. But I was saying that there are some analysis which show that it's usually better to use a complete phrase as your password. Yes, they claim that here, that one with a bunch of numbers and special characters. Not only it's easier to remember, but may have the same complexity in cracking. Yeah, sure. The longest, let's say, the longest the password, the hardest it's going to be to crack it using simply hard force, right? Trying every possibility. But again, although when I was reading this, I was thinking, okay, this makes sense to some extent, because at the same time, it would depend on the sentence that you're using, right? You may be using one of those sentences that will be already in the list of, let me try these 1,000 words before I try something else. And we all think that we are clever in thinking, safe passwords. But you probably also read the most used passwords in the world are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or simply the word passwords. A few years ago, I had one undergraduate student of mine whose research was, whose TCC, trabalho de conclusão de curso, was on passwords. And he was interviewing people and basically trying to understand how they made up their passwords. And it was crazy how we all, we all hide the key below the mattress. We all think that we're clever, finding a way of securing our passwords, but it turns out that we're not that creative. Yeah. All right. So what else here? So basically, they discussed the idea of establishing policies and of course making people aware of the problems. And again, when I talk about the one side talking about security, the other side talking about the inconvenience we generate, there's another issue that the more we get concerned with security issues, the more paranoid we get. The more we, for example, when we receive an email, we consider that that's fraud when it actually isn't. So in statistics, they usually mention two kinds of mistakes that we can commit: the false positive and the right. The false positive meaning that you believe that let's say an email is a fraudulent email when it isn't. But there is also and that happens a lot when we become paranoid, right? You start thinking that that's a false positive, and what happens is that many emails that were real, you take as fraud as well. So you're either mistaken because you're taking as fraudulent an email that is real, or you could also be mistaken as you consider it fraudulent and it's real, or you consider it real and it's fraudulent. But we tend not to fall into the second situation simply because we are becoming a society of paranoid people, right? So what happens is we are throwing away a lot of real stuff in the garbage simply because we think it's not only garbage, it's malicious. And there could be business opportunities for the organization. All of that is also in that basket. So again, this issue is not at all not resolved. We still have to deal with it a lot. They have a topic specifically on what should management do, right, with respect to security. So, well, basically, first create a cybersecurity strategy. They claim here that we should think of security strategy about the infrastructure itself to help that, definition of policies, working on the culture itself of the organization, and investments. So they say that 5 elements need to be addressed. With respect to the infrastructure, they claim here that multi-factor authentication is going to be each time more important and the way to go, because otherwise we're not able to figure out if whoever is trying to assess the system is someone who's entitled or not. So I hope we find other ways, but I'm not sure. I have this feeling also that we're getting paranoid, and the way and that's not a good way to go. And the way to make sure that something is not fraudulent involves each time more effort, and that's also draining energy from organizations. Here they differentiate. They say that sometimes companies can sort of hire what they call here white hat hackers, which are hired to break into the systems in an effort to help the client firm uncover weaknesses. They claim they call here those hackers white hackers, the good ones. They call black hat hackers those who try to invade the company to get their own benefits, for criminal reasons. And they also mention here the gray hat hackers would be those that would be testing an organizational system without an authorization, but with the intention of notifying the company later and let's say help them find their weaknesses. They just remind us that although these guys may be helpful, this is also illegal, because whenever someone makes an attempt to let's say to assess a system for which he or she is not allowed it, one never knows what their intentions are, right? So companies have all the right to try and prevent from that. So gray hat hackers are not welcome either. They discuss the possibility of developing a cybersecurity culture, which could be, for example, a way of making sure that people make better judgment, better assessment of situations that could be risky. And as I told you, we are becoming each time more paranoid, which means if someone gives us 10 emails for us to assess and check if they're valid emails or if they're fake or if malicious, and let's say that 5 are real emails and 5 are malicious, tendency, and we don't know, tendency is that we're going to say that 8 of them are malicious and only those that obviously aren't are okay. So this is also not a very good culture, right? A culture in which we become so obsessed with the risk of mistakenly opening the door to criminals that we don't open the door to anyone any longer. Yeah. And notice how that's affecting our culture, not only in organizations. Scam is affecting our culture even in the way that we deal with the telephone these days. I mean, in the past, if the phone rang, we would just call, we would answer, right? Now we don't answer the telephone any longer if we don't know the name of the person who's calling us. Okay, that prevents us from a lot of scam, but at the same time, it prevents someone who could have a reasonable reason to try and reach out to us, prevents them from contacting us also. So that only shows how paranoid we became. They also mention the possibility of what they call SETA, security, education, training, and awareness. Right? They say that this is something that the company should do, should develop the security, education, training, and awareness. But curiously, they say that awareness, although it is the last item here in this acronym SETA, awareness should be the first one. We should be aware of the issues related to or concerning concerning security to then before we're trained and so on and so forth. So users need to know what to do, how to do it, and that they can actually complete their tasks. But at the same time, they say here that insiders being the people that work for the company, do not always notice signals that might indicate a problem. So this is the reason to try and educate people. And then it mentions those, what they call defense in depth, which involves several layers, multiple layers of different security policies and practices. So when one layer fails to stop a perpetrator, another layer might be more effective. They claim that this is something that has been mimicked from the medieval castles strategy to defend themselves. So castles had multiple layers of defense. First, the castle had very high stone walls, making direct attacks difficult. Then guards were placed on the top of the castle with weapons, and they could use to ward off attackers. Castles were often located in a physical location that was difficult to reach, such as, for example, the top of a hill. Sometimes there were moats or lakes around the castles, and access required a bridge to cross the moats. So the bridge would be lifted whenever a dangerous situation was there. So several different layers to prevent. If for a perpetrator to be successful, lots of those layers would have to be overcome first. I guess this was it. It also has this chapter 7 also has 2 study cases at the end. Again, I want to start paying special attention to the study cases because they will inspire you in thinking of the study case that you will write for our class here also. They had 2 of those here. The first one was on hacking of flight planes of the Polish company. I don't know if we call it LOT or LOT, and United Airlines, and then the second one is on how criminals, basically some North Korean hackers, convinced Sony Pictures not to release a movie that had some, let's say, images or that had some story there that was not pleasant to the government of North Korea, and they were able to prevent Sony from releasing that film after crashing into Sony's systems and getting information about a lot of their employees and so on and so forth. They also have some interesting questions that they pose for those 2 case studies. Again, I want you to read those case studies now with even more attention to think of ways of writing your own cases. And I guess this was it for chapters 6 and 7. Next week we will do chapter 8, which is about the business of information technology. Let me just check here if we do have anything else in addition to that, but I think that's just it. The business of IT, chapter 8. And I want to focus you to focus on the case study of Air France and KLM Airlines that appears there, which we'll also discuss. Elida said, I think we're being paranoid with everything and anyone, not only at the IT field. Yeah, but notice, Elida, that most of those, if you think of all the paranoids about it's basically information and communication systems, because the web, the cell phone is also an IT, and this is.
Yeah, no, I just talk about even in relationships, friendships, we are always like paranoid about if the person is being truth, and if it's all that we are hearing are real. So I think it's like coincidence.
And our technologies shape the way. And your microphone today is really noisy.
Sorry.
Yeah, just check it for next class, because there's something that is not working well there. But anyway, what I was saying is that our technologies always have intentions on them. They are developed with specific intentions, but technologies also have their own intentions. They have the intentions of the developers, and they also have their own spirit, let's say. I don't think that's, for example, the cell phone, when designed by the technologists, that their intent was that we would not talk on the phone any longer, right? But that just happened, and I'd say, and I only mentioned that because I think the main reason why it happened was basically, well, there are two issues there. One of them is scam. If whoever is phoning you is someone you don't know, you think there is a chance that they're going to that this is already problematic. And the other thing is, in the past, there was a cost in generating a call, right? And at least if someone, even if it was spam, if they were just trying to get contact with you, they had a cost. So that reduced the level of calls that you would get. And nowadays, I mean, technology, making a call became so cheap that if it's not a scam, it's spam. And very difficult, very hardly it's going to be another human you want to talk to. But notice that the problem with that is that it changes our culture, it changes the way we behave with respect to the technology, and it changes ourselves, because, as you said, we're probably also less inclined to talk to other people today, because, you know, we're keeping apart, let's say. All right, guys. So I guess this is it for today. So see you next week, chapter 8, the business of information technology. Okay, see you guys.